Hey guys, what's going on? I recently made this really cool concrete side table and it was honestly really simple. I went to rogueengineer.com and that website shows you everything. Shows you what wood to get, how to cut the wood, all the angles, the concrete, how to pour it, and the mold size and all that. Really simple, and it came out great. Check it out.
So the first part of this project was probably the hardest, and that is to make the wooden base. I had to use a protractor to measure out the angles since I don't have a miter saw. I've never done this before, so this was definitely a learning process. After I messed up the first couple angles, I started to double check each angle with a protractor app on my phone just to make sure it was correct. So I continued cutting each piece at the specified angles, which were 40 degrees, 50 degrees, and 10 degrees. But I noticed I had some burrs left after each cut. I made sure to sand down the burrs, but also the entire piece to make it look uniform before staining it.
Alright, I just finished cutting all these up, and honestly, it wasn't that bad considering I didn't have a miter saw. So, yeah, pretty stoked about it. Next step, we'll be using this pocket hole jig, which I've never used before, but always a first time for everything.
The instructions called to use a pocket hole jig so there are no visible screws. I used it throughout the project and loved it. The tool is super simple and gives you a counter bore hole in the wood. Next step was to assemble the frame. I put some wood glue on the contacting surfaces and did my best to line everything up, even though it wasn't always perfect. Then I used the pocket hole screws to connect the pieces. Basically, I'm forming two X's and attaching them together with wood glue and pocket hole screws. After forming the first X, I screwed together the pieces to make the second X, then drilled pocket holes so I could attach both X's together. This was my first project using the pocket hole jig, and I loved how easy it was and the higher quality look you can achieve with no visible screws.
Alright, I just finished the frame and it came out pretty good. There's a couple, little hiccups here and there, but overall pretty good. What's cool about it is there's these plugs. So in these holes, you can just plug it up like so, and therefore you got hidden screws. So that's awesome. And so I'm gonna do that, and then I'm going to try to even out the little bits of like where the two pieces join together at the joints. I'm gonna try to even that out with some wood glue and some wood patch, and then I'll stain it all and it'll look great.
I installed all the pocket hole plugs with the help of some wood glue and a little bit of persuasion with a hammer. I then spread the dark toned wood patch on all the joints to help smooth them out. While waiting for the wood patch to dry, I cut the pocket holes in the four top support wood pieces that will rest on the concrete. Once the wood patch was dry, I sanded it down so I was left with a small portion just on the joint. When we stain the wood, we want the beauty of the wood to stand out, not the wood patch. After sanding the wood patch, I could finally assemble the frame. I put the frame together using the pre-drilled pocket holes. I tried to assemble it on a level surface, but if it's not quite level when you finish, you can always sand down the bottom of the legs. I was honestly a little surprised how well it turned out. I installed the top supports, then brought it outside for staining. I flipped the piece upside down and stained it with Old Master's dark walnut wiping stain. To apply the stain, I brushed it on with a crappy paintbrush. You don't need anything special for this. Then I took an old rag and wiped off the excess while trying to work it into the wood a little bit.
Just finished staining the base, and oh my goodness. You know when you do a project and you see online and show you some instructions and you do it and it doesn't come out nearly as good? This was the exact opposite. This thing looks phenomenal. So happy it came out well. This is great, and let's get on the concrete grind.
To make the concrete mold, I measured out a 28-inch diameter circle on a piece of melamine using that trick with a ruler and a pencil tied to a piece of string. I then cut it with a jigsaw, which is definitely the most satisfying 15 seconds of this entire video. I'll shut up and let you watch. After the mold was cut, I wrapped it in aluminum flashing and clamped it to the sides of the mold with a ratchet strap. I then applied a thin bead of silicone along the mold seam and went back over it with a Sharpie to try to get a nice fillet. Also, make sure to cover the flashing overlap with tape. I forgot this and had to do it after.
Alright, I'm about to mix the concrete. Super pumped. It's gonna look great. I know it because I did a practice mold. I thought I put a little too much water in, but turns out that it actually looked really good. So this one comes out like that one came out. Wow, it's gonna look great. I got the concrete, I got the wheelbarrow to mix the concrete, and my fancy water measurement tool.
Instead of mixing all the concrete at once, I split it into 2 batches to make the mixing process a little more manageable in a wheelbarrow. I was happy to have moral support from our dog Paisley. Thank you, Paise, much appreciated. Before doing this project, I did some research into what concrete consistency you want for countertops, and it seems like you want the concrete to be a similar consistency to peanut butter. So honestly, I didn't look at the mixing ratio on the bag. I just looked at the concrete mix and tried to get that peanut butter consistency. I spread the concrete by hand inside the mold and made it as even as I could, making sure to get it in all the corners. I then tried to get all the bubbles out by hitting the table with a mallet and shaking it. You want to keep doing this and doing this and doing this until you're absolutely sick of it to get out all the bubbles. Finally, I reached the part when I could put that beautiful frame on, but it didn't go on easy. I really had to work it into the concrete. I even dug out a little bit where the legs fit in. Once I thought it was in a good spot, I made sure it was level before letting it cure for a couple days. After curing, I removed the ratchet strap and flashing and it came off really well. This was the most nerve-wracking part because I didn't know how well it would turn out. Would there be a massive bubble, or would the wooden legs accidentally poke through the concrete, which honestly might look pretty cool, but I didn't know. It was kind of hard to maneuver since the concrete weighs about 80 pounds. I had Al help me out so we could make sure not to break it. To my delight, there were no major bubbles and the legs did not poke through. It looked really good. I let the table cure for about a week before taking it outside to sand it. I did a dry sand on it using an orbital sander with 100 and 120 grit sandpaper. And what this process does is, yes, make it smooth, but also bring out all the tiny bubbles that only had a thin layer of cement over them. In order to fill those bubbles, I made a slurry of Portland cement and water. Portland cement is basically the concrete without the aggregate, without the rocks in there. I put this slurry right on the concrete and tried to work it into those tiny bubbles with my hands. This took longer than you'd think because there were so many of those tiny little holes. I then used a plastic trowel to remove the excess cement and also continue to push it into all those holes. After waiting 24 hours for the cement to dry, I went back at it, sanding all the cement down to the original table height. And what I was left with was amazing! All those little bubbles were filled and it left a beautiful smooth finish. The final step in the process was to apply a sealer, and I used Cheng's, which is a water-based, food-safe, penetrating sealer. Since concrete is porous, the whole idea is to have the sealer penetrate the concrete at the same rate across the table. If one spot penetrates the concrete faster than another, you'll see visible streaks where the sealer was applied. To prevent this, I soaked the concrete with water for about 5 minutes so that when you apply the sealer, it penetrates the concrete slowly and doesn't cause streaking. I also diluted the sealer with a ratio of 1 part sealer to 3 parts water to further decrease the rate at which the sealer penetrates the concrete. The biggest thing I learned when applying the sealer is to constantly move it across the surface. Again, that is to prevent the sealer from penetrating at different rates, which causes streaking. I moved the Cheng sealer across the surface for about 5 minutes. After those 5 minutes were up, I took a clean wet towel and wiped it across the surface to pick up any leftover sealer. You can see this happening if you see those dark spots where there's more sealer getting absorbed, but the lighter spots are where the sealer is already working, there's no more sealer that can be absorbed with the concrete. Overall, I am super happy with how this table came out and it looks absolutely gorgeous. I plan to sell this one, but Allison keeps encouraging me to make another one for our living room because she likes it so much. Hello everyone, thanks again for watching, and thanks in general for all your support, both on social media and also at Bernat Antiques. We really appreciate it. I want to run through a couple things that I would have done differently having done this project if I were to do it again. And this will hopefully help you out if you do this project. One of those would be to level the mold itself. I leveled the legs, but the mold itself was not quite level, so it's a little bit thicker on one side than it is on the other side. The other thing I would change would be the type of concrete. So I used a general high strength concrete from Quikrete, but I would really use a concrete countertop specific mix if I were to do this project again, just because it's a little bit easier to work with. And the main difference between those two is that the countertop mix will have smaller aggregate, so the rocks won't be huge and it won't look like you're shoveling literal rocks into the mold. And I think it'd just be easier to work with all together. Once again, thanks for watching the video and thank you for all your support.